What's up, guys? On this episode of Piston Head Garage, we're back in the shop working on the Z32. The block is back to the machine shop, so it's time to assemble the bottom end and get it ready to put back in the car. What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Piston Head Garage. I'm Garrett, and on this episode, I'm going to start reassembling the VG30 for the Z32. It's back from the machine shop, so it's fresh and clean. So we're going to start putting the rotating assembly in and kind of building up the engine. This is going to be a multi-part series because it's going to take way too long to cover everything in one video, even with some time lapses and stuff, so be prepared for that. But anyway, on the first part, I'm hoping to get all the pistons and rods and the crank and bearings and all that sort of stuff done, so stick around and watch me go through it. Now that the block is fresh and clean back from the machine shop, the first step is to start putting the new bearings in. This is a brand new Clevite bearing set for the VG30 that we ordered. Now with these bearings, you want to make sure that the holes that you can see in the clip here are facing the block and not in the main caps, because that's where the oil comes through to lubricate the bearings. Also, there are 3 different types of bearing that go in the block. There's a skinny one, a medium width one, and then there's one that looks like it's got a flange on either side of it. You can kind of see it, the last bearing that goes into the block here. Just make sure that they are going in the right order. It'll vary from engine to engine, but in this case, the skinny one goes on the 2 skinny ones go in the middle, and the wide one goes on the front of the engine, and the flange one goes at the back of the engine with the thrust surfaces. So once the bearings are installed, I set the crank down on top of the bearings, making sure not to rotate it because I'm using no lubrication right now, because I'm going to be using plastic gauge to measure the clearance between the bearings and the crank journals. So we're installing ARP main studs in this block, mainly because they are cheaper actually than the OEM bolts, but also because they do offer more strength and they are reusable. Once everything's torqued down, I then detorque and remove all the nuts. Basically start in the middle, kind of work my way out step by step, not loosening off one nut entirely until they're all loose, and then I pull the girdle off. And then we can take the measurements, which I'll go over in more detail once we come to the rods. But for the meantime, basically we take the measurements, make sure everything's within spec, and then after that, the next step is to clean all the plastic gauge off of the mating surfaces, lubricate everything up, put the crank back in, and then bolt everything down one last time. Also, I forgot to point out that on this block there are 2 oil diverter plates that are located in the block that kind of go underneath where the crank is sitting, which you can't see with the crank in place. So before you put the crank in, make sure those get bolted in. They're shown here. And then there are 3 oil squirters that have to go in as well that squirt oil up into the pistons to help keep them cool and keep them lubricated. So those go in first. Make sure also you replace the gaskets for the squirters because they're probably 30 years old like these ones are, and they're all worn out. Okay guys, so the crank is back in with the oil squirters and the oil diverter plates. And I did also put piston 1 into cylinder 1 and get it all figured out just to make sure that everything was going to go together properly with the bearings that I have. All the main bearing clearances have been checked with plastic gauge and they are all within spec. So the next step is to check all the bearing clearances for the rods. Like I said, I already did piston 1, it's good to go. So I'm going to go through the process of doing piston 2 and show you kind of how to use plastic gauge. It's a pretty old school tool, and it isn't really that super precise, but it works well enough for what we're doing here. We just want to make sure that we're in the ballpark, so we're not going to be not enough in terms of clearance. So anyway, so the first step, of course, is to install the bearings on the rods. So we'll put you up on the tripod and I'll show you, the basic process there. It's the same thing as the main bearings, but I'll show you anyway. All right, so here is the piston and rod assembly. It's been cleaned up. It doesn't look very clean, but yeah, this is some just basically like old piston scoring, right? Like, well, not scoring, but burning basically from, you know, combustion. This thing was run for a while without any sort of tune on it. So, you know, all things considered, the pistons are actually in pretty good shape. There is some wear on the skirts, but not that much. And it's not really in the budget to go forged for anything, so we're gonna use what we got here. So all the ringlands, all the grooves here have been cleaned out of all the goo and stuff. So like I said, the next step is to basically install the bearings. And this is piston number 2 and rod number 2. I believe there is a way to identify, well, there isn't a way to identify which piston is which because they're all the same. But the front of the piston is the little dot right here. So all of them have that dot, that faces the front of the engine. But in terms of the rods, they are marked on the end caps here. I don't know, let me try zooming in. See if I can, there we go. All right, anyway, so you can see there's number 2 on there and they are matched up. If I go to this side, this is the grade number. So if you're ordering OEM bearings, which we didn't, we went with Clevite bearings, or Clevite, whatever you want to say, you would go by these grade numbers. So this is a grade 0, but in our case, we're using aftermarket bearings. So yeah, so that's what we do. So anyway, so I'll loosen the nuts off the cap. I just noticed that there is a bearing already installed in this one from before, an old bearing. So these things are tight. Try not to pull straight up pretty much if you can. And if you can't get them to come off by pulling, you might have to tap it with like a rubber mallet or something. So, oh, there we go. All right, caps off. This one here, you can see there's some heat marks on it, but it isn't scored or anything like that. So obviously the bearings weren't spinning or whatever, which obviously you don't want. And then this one here, you can see this is the old bearing, and you can see there is, you know, some wear on it, but it's not crazy. So I'm just gonna flip this out like so. So then you want to basically clean. There's a bunch of Varsol in here from cleaning the piston, but basically you want to clean the surfaces that the bearing's going to mount to, or sit on, or whatever, and then we'll pop the bearings in. Okay, so I've got the new bearings here. They come in pairs, each box. So I got a set of 6 of these, obviously. And the bearings themselves are identical. They each have an oil control hole here, as well as a little notch in the top. So it doesn't matter if they go in the cap or the rod, as long as you line up the hole on the rod side. So on the cap side, these ones, you could see there's a little dot. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but there's a dot right there where the oil hole used to be. So that helps line it up, but also, I mean, the notch here in the cap has to line up with this notch here in the bearing. So we'll get her flush there. Pop it in, just like that. Like I said, make sure that the surface behind it is nice and clean. No debris or oil behind it. So that's that one. And then for the rod, you can see there's a hole here for the oil. Make sure that you line this up. But like I said, you pretty much have to line the notch up on the top here, so you can't really mess that up. So that bearing's in, easy peasy. And then when you assemble this on the crank, make sure that you can see here, I've got, this side has the grade on it, and there's a 0 here. But if you have, like, say you're doing, in my case I was doing cylinder 1 and it was a grade 1, so there was 1s on both sides, you basically just line up the numbers that are oriented the same way, so they're straight up and down rather than like on their side. So this is the way this cap goes on, because these are obviously paired together in such a way that they're only supposed to go on one way. But you can install them backwards, and then they won't match up perfectly, and it may not do anything, but it also may cook your bearings. So anyway, the next step here is to lower the piston and rod into the bore. I don't have rings on it yet, because that makes it a lot harder to do. So I'm going to drop it in without the rings attached. Just be very nice and careful and go nice and slow and just drop it straight down onto the crank. Make sure that the bolts and the bottom of the rod doesn't touch the inside of the bore and scratch it up too much, because obviously that will affect compression and affect the longevity of the engine. And we're rebuilding this so it should last a bit longer, and we don't want that to be the problem. So let's go back over to the block and we'll get this guy installed. Okay, so I've got the crank set up so that the journal for the rod is directly beneath me. So that way, as long as this stays hanging straight down, it's going to go straight on there. I'm not going to have to worry about it scratch up the journal. The orientation of the piston doesn't matter too much at this point, but for the sake of consistency, I'm going to have the front of the piston face the front of the engine like you're supposed to. Like I said, there's a dot on the front that faces the front of the engine. So we'll take her and ever so gently drop her in there. Now, keep in mind, this thing will fall right through because there's no rings there to stop it. So you're gonna have to get up underneath, feel the bolt, and use the bolt to or the stud to slowly let the piston down onto the crank. Boom, once you're onto the crank, that's it. So I'm gonna turn this on its side so I can get at the bottom. But don't turn it over because your piston's gonna fall right out. Definitely don't want that to happen. Also, I should note that I put a good coating of ATF on the inside of each of these cylinder bores, so that way you're not going to get too much metal on metal action, because that's bad. So now, in terms of doing the plastic gauge, I'm going to reposition the camera here. We want to make sure that this piston isn't going to fall out, which is not. Okay, I've got pretty shallow depth of field here, so hopefully this is in focus. But you can see that we've made it all the way down here. We're sitting flush on the journal. Oh, I just bumped it, so now we're not. There we go. Doesn't really matter too much if it moves right now. So the next step is to take the plastic gauge and set it on top of the journal here. So it doesn't really, you can put it right on top if if the engine's right upside down, but I don't have somebody to hold the piston for me, and I don't want to have to try to jimmy with it, so I'm going to leave it on its side and just put the plastic gauge right about where it won't fall off. So if you haven't seen plastic gauge before, which I hadn't, well, I mean I have in the past, but I hadn't used it until just this build. It's basically comes in these paper strips and has these grades on the side of it, and it comes in different colors. This is green, and green is good from 0.001 to 0.003 inches. So I believe that's 1 to 3 thou of clearance. And all it is some little plastic strips inside here, which I'll pull out in a minute. And then when you sit them on the journal, you torque down the cap, and basically the amount of squish you get out of that determines what your gap is. Now I realize here I'm not going to be able to get the cap on because it's a girdle, so in that case I'm going to try to turn the crank a little bit first before I do that, because I don't want that to get in the way. Okay, so now I can get the cap on. So I'm going to grab a piece of the plastic gauge here out from inside this doodad. There's not very much left in here, actually. Okay. Typically you want your piece to be about as wide as the journal. This piece isn't quite that wide, but you want to lay it across the journal, not up and down. So now that it's across, we'll grab the cap and use no lubricant while you're doing this. It has to be dry, or you can use a thin film of oil and then wipe it off, just so that way you're not grinding anything, but at the same rate, you just don't want to move anything. Don't spin the crank while this is being done. So once again, put the cap on in the right orientation. So this way is up. Slide it on there, like so. Make sure you hold the piston, like that. And then we'll put the nuts on. Make sure you put them in the right way. There's one side you could see there's more wear on it, so it kind of shows which side was up against the metal of the cap. Okay. And also for the sake of this, there is a little bit of oil on the nut, just so that it you can get the torque to be accurate when you tighten it down, because you do not want this to bind and then you don't get the correct torque figure, because that'll throw off your reading a little bit. All right, so I got them finger tight, so now I'm going to tighten them down with my torque wrench. This is a 14 millimeter. These guys here are, the factory spec is, I think it's around 12 foot-pounds and then turn an additional 65 degrees. But I do not have an angle gauge. Fortunately, the service manual also says that you can torque it to a set amount, which in this case is 28 to 33 foot-pounds. This torque wrench is a 250 foot-pound torque wrench, and my 3/8 drive one is, I think it goes up to about 20 foot-pounds, so neither are really that good for this. But thankfully, at least this one on the low end is 30 foot-pounds, which is within that range. With these bigger ones, once you crank it down to its lowest reading level, it might not be as accurate as a smaller one, but for my sake, I think we should be good as long as we're within that range. So this is a bit, these should be tightened down maybe with a ratchet first, just to get them snug, but I'm feeling lazy and I don't want to deal with that, so I'm just going to do it the slow way, but requires less tool changes. So I'll just go a little bit at a time, back to back, back and forth, until the gap closes up between the bearing or between the cap and the rod. So once it gets snug, I'll just keep working it a little bit back and forth. Give it 2 more little twists here, and then I'll work it to its actual spec. 30-ish there, 30 there, and that's that. So the next step is to back it right back off. So I'll crack this loose, a little bit at a time on either side, just for safety's sake, until they're finger tight. Okay. And now what I usually do is I take one nut off all the way. That. And then the other one I just loosen off till it's about maybe 1 or 2 threads below the surface. And then take a rubber mallet, or in this case a dead blow hammer, and just tap the stud until it separates. Now they're separate. Now you can undo this the rest of the way. Pull that off, remove the cap. I'm going to slide the piston out of the way a little bit. Gently rest it there so you can see what's going on. All right, let me come on in here. All right, so it's hard to see here because the zoom on this, it doesn't focus too well. But anyway, you can see how here's the plastic gauge and it's all mushed out. All right, so I grabbed the piece of paper that it came in, and you basically just take the marks here, the green marks, and line it up next to your plastic gauge and see which is closest. So you can see here it looks like this middle white one is the closest in terms of width. Sorry about the focus there. Yeah, right? That one's pretty close. That one, the green is too wide. The white is pretty much dead on. That's at its widest point, right? So you read that is 0.0015. All right, so 0.0015 is our number. Okay, so you look over here at the service manual that I have open. The connecting rod bearing clearance standard is 0.0011 to 0.0019 inches, right? And based on our plastic gauge, we're at 0.0015, which is pretty much dead in the middle of that range, which means we are good to go. The piston, or cylinder 1 piston, that rod clearance was actually 0.0019, 0.002, which is a little on the high side, but if you look below it, the limit is 0.0035, and we're well below that, so it's not like we're shot in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, that's basically it. Now that I've done the plastic gauge, and we know that we're good, we're going to pull the piston back out, and we'll install the rings, and I'll show you how to do that. Alright, that's all the time I have left for this video. Make sure that if you like the video and you want to see more, that you're subscribed to the channel and give it a thumbs up. As always, I'm Garrett. I'll see you next time on Piston Head Garage.